Hi, everybody. Today's Monday, March 16, 2026, and our dear friend or brother, Colonel Jacques Baud, is here with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me again. Happy to see you.
Colonel, let me start with what's going on with the Strait of Hormuz. Donald Trump came out and said the army is out, the navy is out. They don't have anything to fight back, and we are, dominating the airspace of Iran. After all, he's begging, China, United Kingdom, and France, Japan. He's somehow begging or somehow asking them to join to help the United States to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. From the Iranian sources, we learned the strait is not closed, but we are controlling under the control of the Iranian army. So far, what we've learned that the United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, and before coming to this live, the Germany, they have announced that they're not going to be part of the operation. And the United States would be alone if they want to go in that direction. Your understanding of the Strait of Hormuz and the way that Donald Trump is changing his rhetoric from being strong and then coming to some sort of conclusion that we need other countries to help us in the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, this is an interesting situation. In fact, the US has put itself into a kind of a paradoxical situation where they attacked Iran. They knew that the Strait of Hormuz would be blocked if they would start, because the Iran had warned the West that it would do that. Oh, for many reasons, by the way. There are also obvious reasons. I mean, if you are in a war situation where you're firing at each other, if you have warships entering this area, so I mean, by just attacking Iran, you created a situation where the Strait of Hormuz is de facto a war zone. So regardless of who controls it, it has become a war zone. And also that's the reason why even before, I mean, not before, but without that Iran specified exactly what they want to do, the insurance companies decided on their own to raise their fees, and therefore preventing any kind of transportation through the strait, because the shipping costs would be exorbitant. So they have created a situation. At the same time, we see that, as you said, it's not completely closed. Iran controls the access and the exit of the Strait of Hormuz, allows some countries such as China to go through the strait, and obviously, apparently, even Iranian ships are going through the Strait of Hormuz without being attacked. By the way, that's very interesting, because when we had the Venezuela story earlier this year, we had the U.S. Navy chasing tankers, Venezuelan tankers, or tankers coming out of Venezuela across the world. And now the US Navy apparently doesn't do that with Iran. And the reason is very simple, because now, regardless of who gets out of the Strait or the Persian Gulf, regardless of who brings the fuel, this oil is necessary for the West. So they don't dare to sink an Iranian tanker, because that would completely destroy the oil supply across the world. And that would make a huge impact on the price of oil instantly. So that means that Iran benefits from a very interesting strategic position. They can use the Strait of Hormuz. The fuel they bring, and that's also why the U.S. also even encouraged India to buy oil, even to Russia. And we see that there are moves both in Europe and the US to have more relaxed approach to sanctions, for the Russian sanctions, namely because we need fuel, we need oil. And therefore, today, these sanctions that were designed to weaken both, obviously, Iran and Russia, are today the expression of the power of Russia and Iran. So we are getting into an asymmetrical situation where the measures you take, in fact, are backfiring against you because they were not well thought thoroughly. There was not a very deep thinking about what do we want to achieve with those sanctions, what do we want to achieve with this war against Russia or against Iran. And today, the West is now obliged to admit that they failed with both their sanctions and their attempts to attack those countries. Because today, both countries are in fact controlling the situation. So that means, if you look at it from the other side, that the West has totally lost control over the situation. And that's very true with Donald Trump. He has engaged into something he didn't engage in, fact, and now he's caught. That's exactly where we are. And destroying Iran further, including the Karg Island and things like this, would have just the opposite effect as what he want to do. Even if Donald Trump declared that he would destroy Karg for fun, that's, we knew that already. The Israeli soldiers killed also Palestinians for fun. So we have here kind of a convergence. But in any case, we see that making war for fun just has absolutely no, can only lead to something worse. And that leads to something that those decision makers we have in the West have not thought about. And now they get trapped in their own trap. And that's very true with the again, this combination of Iran and Russia is very true because we have now Europe caught in the middle of, at least the US has some oil production capabilities, even if the oil quality is not exactly the same as the one you find in Iran. In any case, there are some capabilities there, also a potential, meaning that the US is not completely cut out of from oil and energy supplies, but Europe is. And Europe has put itself in this situation. And if you compare this, if you look globally at what we have in the world, China, as an example, depends only for something like 2 to 3% from the Iranian oil, meaning that China is 80% independent energy-wise, meaning that they have their own 80% of their needs is covered by their own resources. They only have to cover 20%, and most of this 20% come out of Russia, meaning an ally, a strong ally now. And from, as I said, from Iran, you have something like 2 to 3%. So it's negligible. It's probably important for China, but it's something you can substitute very easily and probably very easily on the international market. Meaning that the West has definitely trapped itself. It's in its own trap. And again, we are exactly in the same situation we had towards Russia. We always think it's like a chess player that only think to the one move. The real chess player think about 8 moves in advance. It can plan or visualize 8 moves in advance. But and that you would expect from a strategic decision making in Europe. in the West. But no, they always think about the next move. Period. They don't think about what is the over next and over next and so they never measure, gauge the impact and the consequence of the decisions, and that's exactly what we have. So this is something that is not really surprising. We have seen that for everything. You see that when it comes to terrorism, when it comes to what happened in Iraq, what happened. I mean, all these actions from the West have failed because they have created situations that we were not able to anticipate. And that affects also migration, immigration, all these narrative that we listen both in Europe and the US, by the way, but with this overwhelming immigration that comes. Well, that was created by the West. You know, we think it's just about killing Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or whoever. But in fact, by destabilizing those countries, we create a kind of a snowball effect that in the end destabilize complete region, meaning that people cannot live, cannot work normally in these regions. It's nice to talk about those Islamic Spring or revolution of each color and things like this. But the reality is that by destabilizing those countries, we make the life impossible there. And where do these people go after? They go where their money is. And they go to the West, they go to the United States. So if you want to fight against immigration, the first step is to stop making wars, especially if those wars are useless. That would be the obvious consequence. But apparently, the Western leadership has not reached that point. We haven't identified that our decision making is simply stupid. Just before this show, we were talking about the AI generated image of Netanyahu. I don't know. We spend a lot of time thinking about artificial intelligence. In fact, we should spend more time thinking about natural stupidity.
Carl, so far what we've learned from IRGC, at least their reports, because they're briefing every day, sending message what is happening on the battlefield. They have mentioned that more than 80% of the U.S. bases in the Persian Gulf were destroyed, and mostly what they have, what remains so far is some of the facilities without the equipment, without radars, and all of this heavy and important equipment in these in these bases. But it seems that Iran is going is going beyond what they had in their mind when the war started. And they're attacking, they're finding Americans in the hotels, and in hotels in all these places that they may use to to let American soldiers get in and maybe change. But the problem with these hotels, with these places that are not fortified, that are not protected, is that Iran can attack them, can kill American soldiers. And I don't know how far the United States can continue with this game, because in Iraq, you look at UAE, you look at even with the Hark, as you've mentioned, Hark Island was attacked, as the Iranian foreign minister says, from UAE, and Iran has attacked, Saudi Arabia, and destroyed or somehow damaged 5 tankers there. How, so far, looking at what Iran is doing in the Middle East, what is the strategy and how far can they go to? Because the final goal, as we've learned from the Iranian officials, is the United States has no place in the Middle East. We don't need the United States in the Middle East. They have to get back home. What is your understanding on their strategy and how successful they were so far?
Well, first of all, we probably have to go into more details. I think by destroying the US facilities in the Middle East, the Iranians are achieving two objectives. The first one is an operational one, since those US bases were used as launchpad for operations against Iran, or partly at least. And Iran cannot afford to have this kind of threats around itself. So, meaning that destroying these bases had an operational aim in the first instance. By the way, whether this distraction is 80%, I don't know. I mean, I cannot assess that, given what you can see from satellite pictures. There were probably 80% of their operational use is destroyed, but probably not the 80% of the facilities, if I can put that way. Because if you destroy, let's say, early warning radar or things like that, or THAAD radars, as they have destroyed many of them, this affects a huge part of the operationability, or the operational side of the base, but it doesn't mean that the whole base is destroyed. So probably 80% refers to the operational capacities or capabilities of the base rather than the physical destruction. That's the first point. But we are here at operational level. If we go to the strategic level, of course, there is another objective that was also clearly stated by the Iranians, that they want to show and demonstrate that the US bases were not here to protect the Arab countries themselves, but to protect Israel and or to destroy Iran. So, meaning that, in fact, this US presence was not related to the improving the situation of Arab state, but was simply there to improve the security of Israel and to attack Iran, period. Meaning that Arab countries do not have any benefit from these US bases. And we have seen that since many air defense assets were withdrawn from the Middle East, I mean, from Arab countries to Israel, or devoted to the protection of Israel, showing that the Iranian claim is right. And that also creates kind of a strategic uncertainty within the Arab community as to whether they should continue to support the US or to have a more neutral stance in this kind of conflict. So this is the strategic objective, and I think the Iranians have reached, in fact, both objectives. The operational one, because now it's unsafe for the Americans to use those bases, and the strategic one, because a lot of people doubt about the sincerity, I would say, of the US presence in the country. And recently, that was last week, by the way, I think it was an official of Kuwait, I guess, but again, I may be wrong, or Bahrain. Anyway, he said, well, the US presence on our territory has dragged us into a conflict that we didn't want. So there is a price to pay for having those US bases. And we know that they are not necessary. I mean, again. So here, Iran has definitely achieved something. Now, when it comes to those attacks against hotels and things like this, and other, let's say, objectives such as oil refineries and things like this, I think we have to be very, very careful. Because a lot of these attacks were, in fact, denied. I mean, the Iranians denied to have launched these attacks, and there might be some people. I say people, but it might be US, it might be Israeli, or whoever, who wants to escalate the situation, therefore attacked soft targets, in particular hotels and things like this, to degrade the situation and to make for the Arab countries, to force them to participate into the conflict. And that's something we have seen in the past doing. I mean, Israel has done that. You may remember this, what I mentioned several times on your channel, the famous Lavon affair in the 1950s, where the Israelis attacked US and British objectives in Egypt in order to force them to maintain a military presence in Egypt, and therefore to help Israel to fight against the Arab, I mean, in that case, Egypt. We had exactly the same thing, and this is the Mossad, the ex-Mossad spy, Viktor Ostrovsky, who wrote that in his book, by way of deception, I think it was the name of the book, that in 1983, the Israeli intelligence services knew that the barracks, the US barracks in Beirut, would be bombed, but they didn't inform the US in order to create a situation where the US would be forced to stay in the region and to maintain a military presence in the region. So we have this kind of behavior from Israel that is not new, that we have seen on several occasions, and that explain probably a lot of also of unexplained attacks against allies, even European allies, by the way. But I don't want to go into the details here. But the idea would be for Israel to force the Europeans, the Westerners, to get involved physically into the conflict against Iran. So again, I don't know the details. We should have a closer look at every single event or bombing or event like in the Arab states, in particular in the UAE, in Bahrain, especially in the UAE. And so again, but we don't have the means now to do that, because obviously we have limited information. Even the UAE has banned now the making movies or videos from these strikes, and therefore we don't know exactly what happened. It's very difficult to have a definitive assessment on that. But I don't exclude the fact that it might be provocations, kind of false flag operations, if you want, in order to create a situation where the Arab state would be forced to engage the conflict. And that comes exactly at the point where we see that Israel now is apparently short of interceptors, is short on military capabilities. He's now attacked also by the situation in Lebanon, and therefore Israel now is caught between two fires, and we may have the Houthis coming into the game shortly, meaning that Israel is really in a very, very difficult situation. The US shows let's say, that it has no appetite to go further into the war. US has been, as I said before, had trapped itself into the situation, but they are very reluctant to go further and to extend the conflict. They know that they cannot do that, and if they would do that, that would lead to kind of disaster, meaning that Israel now is feeling more and more abandoned by the West. The European countries have no means to intervene in the region. They don't have the willingness to do so. They have enough problems within Europe. And in addition to that, the whole issue of Iran is now distracting the public opinion from the main battle of the West, which is in Ukraine. That means that the situation now turns to be very unfavorable to Israel. And at the same time, Israel started the issue. So, well, they miscalculated their action, and and now they will pay the price for this. And I think in the West, you have less and less people who are willing to take side with Israel, because they know that Israel now has a very bad reputation, has, in fact, has lost the prestige it used to have in the 60s or 70s or so. And today, especially after what happened in Gaza, nobody wants to be, even if they don't want to criticize openly Israel, but at the same time they don't want to be presented as an ally of Israel, especially because of these mass human rights violations and war crimes and so on and so forth. So therefore, Israel begins to be extremely isolated. Um, and we are moving towards a decisive victory of Iran, and Iran will strive for this, for having this decisive victory, because that's the only way for Iran to uh, to secure its future, if you want. It's part of its deterrence. That's why they tried to do in 2024. It didn't work out. In 2025, on two occasions, it didn't work out because the Israelis are not willing to learn from that. And they have started this operation against Iran based on their assessment they had already 2 years ago, meaning that now they are trapped in their own decision again. And Iran knows that if it stopped now the conflict, that will give enough leeway to Israel to rearm and to resume its operation. So Iran needs a decisive victory over Israel. That's the situation in which Israel has put itself.
Carl, before this war started, we were talking about the conflict, the new war between Iran and the United States together with Israel. And various times we came to the conclusion that there is no viable choice for Israel, for example, because the United States is not living in the region. Israel is located in the region. People of Israel are in the region. That's why you have to consider the balance of forces. A country with 8 million people going against a country with 92 million people. Even is not they're not even comparable. But many people were arguing in the mainstream media that Israel is strong, Israel can do this and that. What is the main source of this miscalculation on the part of the West? Why did they want to achieve? Because it seems that as time goes by, then this war is turning into a war of attrition, which would be, we knew that before it happened, and then Israel, why there's so much suicidal in their attitude of getting involved in new wars, and there because it's not about Iran, it's with Hamas, with Hezbollah, Iran, and the new rhetoric is Turkey, and then maybe next Pakistan. These people are not gonna sit and say we have limited capabilities. We cannot go against all of these countries around in the region, and nobody seems to understand to help them to convince them that you're not that much capable of going that far against the people, mostly these big countries in the Middle East. Your
Yeah.
understanding of that?
Well, Israel suffers from the same syndrome as what we have seen with the US, in fact, because making war against armies that have poor air defense, they are technologically probably not on a top level. It's easy. It was an easy war against Saddam Hussein in 1991. The same in 2003. Of course, it was easy to intervene in Afghanistan and to fight against the Taliban, who had only a Lee Enfield rifle from World War II, or maybe some Kalashnikov or things like that. But what I mean is that the Israelis relied extensively on their technological superiority. That's how they achieved success in 1967, in 1973, also with the massive support from the West in having top notch equipment that the Arab state didn't have at the time. And from that uh, idea of technological superiority, the Israeli have derived not just technological superiority, but simply superiority. They had a very strong aviation. They can bomb everywhere. I mean, they have a very, very sophisticated aviation, very strong. And today, with also the F-35, things like this, allow them to bomb almost any country in the Middle East, and especially because these countries didn't have very strong air defense systems. So, from that illusion of superiority, the Israelis felt they were omnipotent in the region. The problem is that, and some experts have also realized that this war with Iran is probably the first war in which the United States and Israel are fighting a peer in technological sense. And that's something they have very massively underestimated. Iran is a highly educated country. I'm not just mentioning the very old culture, and but when we talk about old culture, it's not just an historical point of view. It's also a culture of um, having intellectuals, of having scholars, of having engineers, of having, I mean, all that is part of the Iranian culture. Um, we discover these fantastic engineering realization of the Iranians also in the past. And today we see that despite the embargo and all the sanctions that have been applied on Iran, they still manage to keep a reliable or fairly reliable air force. They certainly have developed a very powerful missile force. And they probably also have developed, and probably with the help of China or Russia, also powerful air defense and electronic defense system, as well as cyber defense. And therefore, we have now a country, because it was threatened since the early 2000s at least, probably even before if we consider the Americans, but especially since the early 2000s, Iran was always threatened by the West, and therefore it had to engage into more development of its military force, not simply quantitatively, but also qualitatively, by developing its own solutions, technological solutions. And we see that they are extremely able to destroy high altitude drones, I mean, Israeli high altitude surveillance drones, and things like this. So we see that Iran is obviously not what Iraq was in 2003. We have here a country that has enough intellectual and material resources, if you want, to develop its own capabilities. In addition to that, they have, uh, and that's probably realized that it's also is related with this intellectual tradition. But I have the feeling that the command and control of Iranian is extremely sophisticated, and the decision making also is extremely sophisticated. We have, I mean, my impression by trying to understand or to analyze the decisions of the Iranians since 2024, we have the feeling that there's a strong sense of what is a strategy a very strong sense of strategical thinking, a very strong sense of military planning, in not just operational planning, but also planning in the widest sense of the word. That you plan also for your infrastructure, your structures, the command structures, and all that is extremely strongly and thoroughly thought. As a result, they may not have the fancy items that the US has. They may not have the powerful navy that the US has. They may not have the fancy aircraft that the US has or the Israelis, but they are able to compensate this some technical differences with a very deep and uh, yes, deep strategic thinking, if I can put it that way. And that may related, although I think the Iranians are obviously at a higher level technologically speaking, but this is very much what you had during the Vietnam War, where the command and control of the Viet Cong was extremely elaborated. They had a very deep knowledge of how the Americans function, how they work, how they understand war, how they wage war, how they make war, how they combat. So all this is very well studied, integrated into the decision making. While on the other hand, when I see decision making in the US and Israel regarding Iran, at least, I have the impression that they always keep underestimated their enemy. They always keep think that the Iranians are not up to the mark as it comes to fighting. I mean, we, for instance, we learn that Israel has started this operation against Iran, although it had not replenished the number of missiles that it lost in 2025, meaning that obviously they didn't understand the very strong capabilities of the Iranians, because they thought that even if they had not replenished their own inventories of missile and all that, they could still afford to or still manage to achieve victory in Iran, meaning that they have a very poor knowledge of the Iranians. And that then leads to something which is my former job, if you want. When you make strategy, when you talk about intelligence, there is not two parts of intelligence. There is basically intelligence collection and intelligence analysis, to make it extremely simple. The Israelis are extremely good at intelligence collection because they have an unmatched capability, a network of people around the world, a part of the Jewish diaspora and things like this, the so-called Sayanim, who can inform the Israeli intelligence, and therefore it's not very. I mean, I'm not saying it's easy, but they have the ability to locate very precisely where Ali Khamenei was, or things like this, because they have this huge network of informants around the world, and Iran certainly too. But this is one aspect of the intelligence, and we tend in the West to praise that aspect because we think that everything is about getting information. Well, my personal experience, both in crisis areas and my old professional previous experience in intelligence, I said the most important is not what you gather, even it's obviously it's important, but it's not the most important. The most important is what you are able to do with the information you have, because you may have a bunch of information, you may have the best information of the world. If you are not able to put that into a proper assessment, it's useless. So obviously it's important to have information, but it's even more important to be able to make sense of that information, to assess that information in order to feed your strategic decision. And that's exactly where Israel is weak. And it's not new. It has always been weak because the problem, and that's something that is probably cultural with the Israelis, they have a sense of superiority that has as a consequence that they think that the rest of the world is simply weaker than they are. And we have seen that in 1973. In 1967 it was different because they attacked without being attacked. So the Arab states were surprised, and therefore the Israelis could use surprise to their advantage. But in 1973, the Israeli intelligence has not been able to detect the Operation Badr, the Egyptian operation to cross the Suez Canal. The Israelis were not able to identify this, although they had the information for that, but they didn't manage to make sense of that. We had the same thing in 1982, where obviously they managed to go to Beirut. They made a lot of distraction and all that, but it was again a tactical victory, if you want, but it was a strategic defeat. And at the end, that's exactly this operation that led to the creation of the Hezbollah in 1985. So and in 2006, that was also the same thing, that the Israeli underestimated the defensive capabilities of the Hezbollah, and the operation they led also to a lot of distraction and all that, but it was a strategic defeat. And we have seen in 2024, 2025, and now in 2026 that the Israeli make exactly always the same mistake. They consistently underestimate their enemy. They cannot make sense of the information they have because they are intellectually or culturally, I would say, prevented to do so, because there's the obsession that they are better than the others. And that exactly, if you want to make a sober assessment of your enemy, you have to accept that you may be inferior to him. And that's exactly what Sun Tzu said 2,500 years ago. He said, well, never underestimated your enemy. That's the worst mistake you can do at war. And that's exactly what the West does. We have this sense, this arrogance of being superior for different reasons. And that leads us to defeat. That's exactly what's happened exactly in Ukraine, by the way. The sense of superiority that the Ukrainians have towards the Russians is exactly what leads them to defeat. And we have exactly the same thing here. So this is something that was more or less predictable, if you want.
Carol, I don't know if you saw the interview, you watched the interview that Donald Trump had on Fox News, in which he says that this is something, these people are terrible. It's talking about the Iranians. It's something in their genetic. He's talking about something. We've learned, we know that from Israelis in, Palestine. They said that these are human animals. And right now, Donald Trump is the problem with Iran is their genetic. They're not like us. And that's why the problem is that, part of what's going on in the mind of these people is somehow racism. And they feel that they're superior. They know better. They fight better. They're better in each and every sense of the human qualities. And where does it come from? Because so far, they were fighting Russians. They tried, since the war started. You remember what has happened with the case of Russia. Russians were in the same position. They were, diminishing the Russian quality and everything. They're using, even the technology, the morality of Russians. They were asking all these questions. It comes to Iran and Palestine. Where does it come from? And what is what do you make of it?
Well, there are different factors here. The first of all is this idea, and that's what Glenn Thiessen used to say in one of his interviews, that Demonizing the enemy is a way to turn your hate into a virtue. And that's exactly what we have in the West. And it's not new. We had this during World War One, World War Two. I mean, this is constant in and that's probably part of warfare to some extent in general. But there is something more here. The In the art of war, the key point, and again we can go back to Sun Tzu 2,500 years ago, where he said, well, you have to understand your enemy as good as you understand yourself. And if you don't understand yourself, you have half chance to win. If you don't understand your enemy, you have half chance to win. But if you don't understand neither yourself nor your enemy, there is no way you can win. And we are exactly in that situation. We tend to overestimate ourselves. We think that we're very superior, and at the same time, we think that the other are stupid. And that also comes from the fact, and probably what I explained, I think it was last week on your channel, when I explained the difference of perception of the word victory that may have different meanings in the West as in the Middle East, and especially in the Muslim culture. And the whole thing is that the cultural difference is so big that when we don't understand the enemy, and we give up understanding the enemy, we put ourselves in a situation where we know there is no way we can understand how we will act. During the Cold War, both sides were probably planning war and possible war across the Iron Curtain and things like this. But, and of course, the eastern part, they were Warsaw Pact, communist, and things like this. They are another ideology, another political system. But when it came to the military operational issues, the difference is not that big, because at the end of the day, on both sides, you have tanks. Tanks have more or less the same speed, they have more or less the same range. I mean, the gun has the same range and the same capabilities, plus minus. But by and large, the armies were similar on both sides. And it was easier to understand how Soviet would think or would react on the battlefield. When it comes to the Middle East, we are in logic that are completely different. And I explained already that last week when it comes to terrorism, for instance. We have a lot of problem understanding how terrorists think. And that's the main reason why we are not able to win over terrorism, because we are not able to do that. We're not able to understand how the terrorist thinks. And this it becomes even more complex when you consider that there's in one of my books I wrote, I used the word terrorism in plural form, which is counterintuitive, because terrorism is a method, basically, is not something that basically we don't see that in a plural form. The problem is that the terrorism we had in the 60s in Europe has nothing to do with the terrorism we experienced just a couple of years ago in the Middle East and in Europe, the ISIS attacks in Europe. These are totally different. You may see similarities because it's the same type of bomb. The bomb is made the same way, and there are still attacks against civilians. Okay, but all that is similar. The tactical level, or the technical level, if you want, is very similar. But when it comes to the strategic dimension, why do they do that? What is the intellectual mechanism behind the use of the method called terrorism? That's where you have differences. And that's where you can win over terrorism. It's not at a technical level, it will be very hard to anticipate If even if somebody tell you that I will attack at 10 p.m. this place, without saying how, it will be very hard to prevent that, even if you know the time, even if you know the location. Because, and I used to have to command a unit where we were used to do infiltration and things like this. If you want to penetrate a system, you can achieve. It may take time, it may take resources, but if you want to do it, you can do it, regardless of the way you do it. So tactical level you will never be able to prevent, but what the only way to achieve success is to act at strategic level, to make people to remove to the terrorists the willingness of doing to attack. And that means that you have to understand why do they take the decision, what is the rationale behind the decision. Okay, well, terrorism is an obvious case, if you want, and I don't want to go into the details because we could spend hours on this, but the whole issue of war fighting in the Middle East is very different from war fighting in Europe. This whole issue of how you understand victory, that is a victory of yourself on yourself and not a victory on the enemy. All that makes your assessment of the enemy very difficult unless you are experienced, unless you have been in the region, unless you are acquainted with the local culture and things like this. The problem is that in our staffs today, we have less and less people who have this kind of experience. Even if they've been in the Middle East for some time, they stayed in bases. They never get out for security reason, and therefore they are not aware of the local culture, the local way of thinking, and things like this. And if you don't do that, there is no way you can win. And this also leads probably to this idea that these people are so different from us. Not that they are different, they just think differently. Simply, when you have a small brain, there's no way you can understand that. And therefore, you will say, well, these are animals. But this reflect this kind of uh, uh, declaration of things just illustrates the size of your own brain, because people are far from stupid. And in fact, I told you, I told you, I don't remember, but in the early 2000s, I was part of a working team of NATO to assess the psychology of terrorists, of Islamic terrorists. And we found out that, especially in Palestine, the intellectual level of the Palestinians were, in the average, much higher than the Israeli ones, or the Israeli security forces. And basically, what you had in among those who were arrested as terrorists and things like that, you had an extremely disproportionate number of engineers, scholars, people who had academic degree, and things like this. Meaning that those terrorists were far from stupid, extremely imaginative, extremely creative, things like. And that's exactly what we have in Iran today. I'm not saying that they are terrorists, but I'm just saying they are educated people with a very high level. And these intellectual capabilities is something that or prejudice or understanding of the local culture tend to reject. I mean, we cannot accept that those people can be more intelligent than we are. And that's exactly the problem. This the weakness, and we can see that very blatantly today. We have a war that was decided by two so-called high-tech countries, namely the United States and Israel, but they're not able to achieve any success. They will do a lot of destruction. They will kill a lot of people, no doubt about this, but they will not achieve success because they don't have a strategy. And that's exactly what everybody starts to realize now, both in Israel, I mean, in the West at large, that they we start a war without knowing what we want to achieve. And everybody has its own understanding of what we want to achieve. Some say it's democracy, some say it's oil, some others say it's a regime change, some others say, I mean, everybody has its own perception of the thing. That means that we don't have a clear understanding of what we want to achieve. And strategy is I would say, the quality of your strategy reflects the quality of your intellectual approach to the conflict. A poor strategy means that you're stupid. I mean, to make it extremely bluntly here. But in essence, this is that. And that's exactly what you see in Europe. I mean, Europe supports Ukraine. Okay, fine. But what do they want to achieve? Nobody knows. They have no objective. They have no strategy. And when you listen to these leaders, the European leaders, I mean, they have the brains of birds. That's all. I mean, you don't have a consistent approach to the conflict, and we have exactly the same thing here in Iran. I mean, the quality, the intellectual quality of the European, the Western leadership today is absolutely terrible, and that should be a source of concern at large. Not just because they start war, but because they wage wars they don't know how to conduct, and they don't know how to win those wars.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Carl, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
That was my pleasure. Thank
And
you for
we know everybody's asking about your. Can you update us briefly about the situation that you are experiencing, the suffering of these, unjust sanctions against you, they imposed on you? What is the current situation with those sanctions?
Well, I'm still in the same situation, so I'm still sanctioned for my freedom of expression. Basically, the Swiss government protested against the EU for that reason, because the EU sanction, in fact, is attacking my own freedom of speech, and that's definitely something that is clear in the whole decision. I have been again subject to no legal decision. It is just a political decision. Period. I have nothing done wrong. I have nothing done anything against any kind of law. In fact, whether in the European Union or in any country of the European Union. So it's a pure sanction against free speech. Point one. Now we have filed an application for annulment of the sanction last week with my lawyers. In order to, we in fact we attacked the accusation and tried to let's say counter all of the accusations that were made. They were not very solid, I have to say. It was extremely weak accusation, but nevertheless, the sanctions them are not weak. The accusation is weak. So I anticipate that eventually we will win. The longer it will take, the more painful it will be for the EU, because my case is becoming very famous all over the world. A lot of parliamentarians of the European Union have also support me. I have many people in different countries, also within EU countries, officials who are supporting my case. Supporting me in my case. So I'm confident that eventually I will win that. The problem is that I'm still limited in accessing my funds. After 1 month, my Belgian bank has finally reopen access to my bank account in a very limited way. I can just buy what I need for essential life, but not more. And it's limited in time also. And I'm still not allowed to travel within the EU, so I'm not allowed to go back to my country. And that's still, so I'm okay. It's not. I'm living here in Brussels, in my home. But again, this is, in fact, I am prisoner within the EU. In fact, that's the. But it. I mean, I'm hopeful, and I think it will come out well at the end. Um, and I'm convinced this will be to my advantage at the end. So I'm full of hope for that.
Yeah. We are so happy that you keep your, morale this high, and you understand that. We know that how it was, the whole process was so much suffering, it bring a lot of suffering to you. But we wish you the best, Carl. You are the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you.
See you